I said that I was going to do 2 videos per month. That was my New Year's resolution for doing content. And I'm down to the wire, but we've got it. We're gonna do it. A year ago, in one of my first videos on this channel, I attempted to deep dive into the draft mode, and I came up with a list of pros and cons, where my conclusion was pretty much that every pro is basically hard countered by a con. In this video, 1 year later, I'm going to revisit my points and discuss draft from the solo duo trio perspective. After this mode has been out for so long, you would have thought things would have changed, right? That's what you would have thought. First, let's give the draft breakdown so everyone is on the same page. Draft came to ranked on Pokemon Day of 2024 when Season 18 started. At that time, draft was not accessible until all players in one lobby had a master rank rating of 1400 and above. This was changed to a master rank rating of 1200, then changed back again. So now it stands that as soon as every player in the lobby is in master rank and at a rating of 1200 or above, they will encounter a draft game. When it starts, the lowest 2 players on each team will select the bans back and forth. The lowest 2 players are usually ranked the lowest in master rank rating, with the exception of a duo and a trio being paired together. In this case, the duo will get to select the bans. Then the team that banned first gets to select 1 Pokemon, the second team will select 2, then 2 on the other side, 2, 2, 1. So the highest ranked player in master rank rating is most often picking first, and the lowest is most often picking last. Again, with the exception of trio queue. Within the draft system, players can request for certain Pokemon to be banned, pre-pick a Pokemon they want before it's their turn to pick, and switch the draft order to select a specific Pokemon earlier. Alright, I think that about covers the broad overview of what's happening in draft. By the time you get to the later part of any given season, it's more than likely you'll be encountering more draft games than non-draft games. I'm going to revisit the pros and cons that I first pointed out in my video a year ago, which came out about a month after draft was first rolled out into ranked. And we're going to first talk through how these points may have changed and what I think of my analysis now, over a year later. My pros were as follows. It makes the game more competitive, more interesting meta picks and items. Highest ranked player picks first. In my old video, I then described the cons, which basically completely refute these 3 pros. The game is not actually competitive, players don't understand counters, and the highest ranked player picks first. Summarizing this now, I built my conclusions that draft isn't great on player understanding and decision making. 2 things that I've talked at length about, and always concluding that Pokemon Unite's players are generally very bad at those things. If you want to watch the early video I made a year ago, you can, so I'm not going to talk about everything all over again, but I basically just talk about how players are going to do whatever they're going to do, regardless of what's happening in draft, whether it's a draft game or not. Though I will be focusing this video mainly on decision making and reasons for said decision making and how it impacts our drafting experience, I do want to highlight one major upside to the draft mode that is such a good thing that it actually makes it not suck, and that is we get to ban a broken thing. As I write this script, Alolan Raichu has been released and it is very strong, though it did get a nerf a couple days ago. It's still very, very good. Definitely one of the strongest things in the game. Prior to Alolan Raichu was Suicune, another very strong release. When you start getting draft games, you can ban these things out or hope your team bans them out. And in terms of the match quality, banning something that's a bit too strong just makes the game experience infinitely better. Climbing up to Masters at the start of a season, knowing you will be facing the broken thing, and you just have to hope that the broken thing on your team is better than the broken thing on the enemy team, just makes for a really frustrating experience. Obviously, having broken things in the game at all isn't a good thing, and it's especially not great in competitive because it means that we limit draft strategy in favor of having to sacrifice a ban or a pick slot for something that's just too good. But MOBAs will always break things. Sometimes MOBAs will just have a broken thing sometimes. And draft lets us ban stuff when that thing happens. And let me address one downside about this as well. And that's since the lowest picked players on the team get to ban, sometimes they don't ban out the right thing. And we've all had those games. It happens. But I believe that overwhelmingly players will successfully ban the broken thing. And that is backed up by data that Unite API puts out weekly, where we see that last week, Suicune was banned out in 82.78% of games. Ultimately, if players will ban this thing in 8 out of 10 games, For me, that remains a very strong pro. In fact, my ultimate fix to draft is just removing draft but keeping the ban phase, but that is a topic for another time. Let's talk about some of the main reasons why draft is often so frustrating. Things from my original video that still perpetuate today based on conversations we are constantly having. One of these is that your one-trick teammate will still pick their one trick. This boils down to players consistently selecting Pokemon that are not optimal for the team composition and or selecting them in the wrong order. Why are they doing this? There's the obvious explanation, of course. They are bad at the game and they don't understand the game. But that's not the only reason. It's also not always the reason. Also, plenty of good players just select whatever they want because they already know they're likely to be the best on the team anyway. Or at least that's what they think. That brings us to our first theoretical explanation, the Dunning-Kruger effect. I like going back into Spraggle's video from a while back where he calls this the Gudra effect. So I'm not the first person to discuss this very popular psychological theory in a Unite context, and I have actually talked about it before on this channel. What the Dunning-Kruger effect basically says is that players will overestimate their skill and use that overestimated skill as a way to guide their decision-making regardless of whether this is optimal or logical. Looking at this figure from the original paper where the Dunning-Kruger effect was proposed, we see that people usually perceive their abilities to be about the same as everybody else, but there's actually a drastic difference across quartiles of logical reasoning ability. So if we say this applies to Unite, players probably all feel they're pretty good at playing. Perhaps they even feel like they're better than most other players, but it's fairly likely that both the bad players and the good players perceive themselves to be good. So our decision to go ahead and draft what we want may be something that every player feels is justified because they think they are really good at this game. Reflect on this yourself too. How often have you entered a draft where you just go ahead and lock in that fifth carry? Now, I've done it, under the assumption that we're more likely to win with me playing a carry than letting my teammates do the carrying. Now, if you aren't a victim of the Dunning-Kruger effect, perhaps you're in that third quartile, where perceived ability and actual ability align pretty well. You're not out of the woods just yet. You might be saying, well, I'm one of the few support players, or I always fill for the team to try to be as optimal as possible. Could it be that is part of your social identity? Social identity theory was proposed in 1979, and it states that people enjoy categorizing themselves into groups and feeling like they belong to these groups. Often this gives us a sense of self-worth. Within social categorization, people automatically categorize themselves and others into different groups. Then with social identification, people will adopt the identity of the group they feel they belong to, often aligning their behavior with others in that group. Finally, social comparison involves comparing groups to other groups, and people will favor the in-group to boost their own self-esteem. We see social identity theory come up a lot in research. It's often used to explain group dynamics and even discriminatory behaviors. As an example that I see on the internet quite a lot, within the queer community, there's often a lot of hate towards trans people, regardless of if they are queer or not. Cis queer people will categorize themselves as queer, and they don't feel similar enough to trans people or non-binary people, so they categorize them as the out group and themselves as the in group. Those trans and non-binary people are not in the in group, they can't possibly be queer. This is where we see a lot of these come up, and I'm sure you can think of plenty of other examples that relate to that. But we're focusing on real-world problems, obviously, Pokemon Unite Draft. This is a joke. In this case, it's very possible that Pokemon Unite players have categorized their playstyle and decision-making into social groups and developed it into their personal sense of self. Let me give you an example. My Twitter profile includes a banner with a picture of Meowscarada on it, and my bio says Flower Trick Enthusiast, to further emphasize my alignment with being a Meowscarada main. I'm sure some of you will be able to recall moments where I've talked about how much I love this Pokemon, and I've talked about it in casting events and even on the official broadcast. This has become part of my identity. Maybe some of you can relate with your own mains, or maybe you pride yourself on being a support main or a fill main. Those strategies and decisions become part of your identity, and perhaps when faced with the decision to do something optimal or align your decisions with your identity, you may select the latter. All right, but maybe social identity doesn't completely capture the complexities of draft strategy. There's also bounded rationality, where it's possible that there's just too much information and not enough time to make an optimal decision, so players just pick something that's good enough, maybe something they know they're pretty good at. Perhaps it's ego depletion, where players have been exposed to so much information after potentially playing a lot of matches at once that they just want to go on autopilot and pick something easy for them to comprehend. When this happens to me, I usually lock in comfy. Maybe it's even psychologically deeper, relating to loss aversion and status quo bias, where players are nervous about playing something that would be more optimal because they don't want to do worse. They struggle with mentally handling the realization that they had a bad game because of an uncomfortable choice they made. Revisiting the online disinhibition effect, which I've talked about before, or because players don't perceive any accountability for their actions in solo queue, they will choose to make selfish decisions. Or maybe the thought of making the decision to deviate would be too stressful, so they fall into pluralistic ignorance and conclude, I don't have to do it, someone else will. Chances are at least one of these potential explanations apply to you, and it's likely that all of them apply to the Unite player base in some capacity. Personally, my favorite explanation is social identity theory, which if you remember from about 30 seconds ago, my high-level explanation, relates to how players may form certain aspects of their identities around social groups they feel they belong to. I discussed a little bit of social categorization, identification, and comparison as possible influences to how an individual may draft, and use myself as an example. I'm a Meowscarada main, so I want to play it. But I'm going to go deeper, because I think this theory deserves it. Social categorization first appears the second you're placed into draft, where you instantly categorize yourself as belonging to your team, and the 5 opposite players as belonging to a different team. To feel a sense of belonging within your group, you want to feel like your team is better, and that you will perform well in your match based on what your team selects. When players on your team make a suboptimal choice in the pick or ban phase, you may feel instantly weary of how you will play together, because you can't possibly identify with someone who's clearly not as knowledgeable of a player as you are. Now, I can't say definitively that this lack of being able to move from social categorization to social identification with your team results in worse play or a worse match experience, because that would take a full-length study, but I can hypothesize that it might. You get into a match and your bottom 2 teammates instantly ban Phalanx and Gudra. You might be like, oof, I don't have any faith in this team, and play a little tilted because of it. Or because of your perception of not identifying with this team, you select something suboptimal, such as a carry Pokemon, because you don't trust your teammates to carry. And this mental processing might all happen within the first few seconds of your drafting experience. Now, in terms of social identification, there's a lot of this going on whether or not you're able to successfully identify with your team as a whole. You come into draft with a preconceived sense of game identity, and I talked about this already. I'm a Meowscarada main is one example. I play tank, or I fill for the team. Or we go a little broader. I am a good player, or even I am the best player on my team. These are all social identities that we may develop based on our experiences. For me as a color caster, I identify strongly with my sense of game knowledge, and I go into draft feeling like I am likely to know the game better than my teammates, even if my actual gameplay isn't the most top tier. When we adopt a social identity, we then conform to that group and adopt behaviors associated with that group. If I feel I'm a good player, here is what a good player would do. Me and the other good Pokemon Unite players would just draft a carry here because we know that our best chance of winning depends on the fact that I'm a good player. Then we have social comparison. And I'm going to go a little outside of draft to break this one down because I think our community interaction often influences our behavior in the game as well. For example, if you are part of the tank main identity group, you may be friends with other tank mains online. You may assume the behaviors of what you think a tank main would. I've seen and done tier lists that categorize different roles into different behavioral patterns that have nothing to do with the game. Like, oh, support mains are always sweethearts. Zeraora mains are the worst type of player. So when you see these inferences by other players in the game, the instinct of the player will be social comparison. If we take the support mains are sweethearts example, that the community made up, it's just a stereotype made up by the community, you may compare your own identity to this. I'm not a support sweetheart main? Does that mean I'm not a sweetheart? Does that mean I'm not in the in-group of support sweetheart mains? In our other example, Zero Aura mains are the worst type of player. Someone who's an Absol main might attach themselves to this stereotype to feel like their choice of social identity is better. Yeah, Zero Aura mains suck, Absol mains are way better. Not only to foster a sense of community with other people who play Absol, but to perform that comparison between themselves and other types of players to feel better about themselves. Now I've formulated stereotypes based on my own social identities. We've all done it. I think the point of this theory is to show us how human behavior often works and perpetuates itself across situations. I feel like 9 times out of 10, if I get into a game with a Greninja player, they are not good players. Is that true? Probably not, but my own experiences combined with my social identity of being a Masquerada player and not a Greninja player makes it easy to compare myself to Greninja players. Therefore, when I see a player on my team select Greninja in draft when it's not an optimal choice, I lose hope for our success in the game. This may cause me to approach draft differently because of the social comparisons I've made between my own identities and the other players. I've seen this firsthand in the community a lot, and I can't help but feel like my inferences that it applies to drafting are likely to be pretty accurate. I've made a lot of tier lists about random stuff that I've posted on Twitter, like what astrological sign I assume you are based on your main, and many people were commenting either very excited that I got it right, and some were commenting upset that I got it wrong. It's because seeing 2 social identities one holds either overlap or not can make us react a certain way even if it doesn't matter what sign you are and what Pokemon you main. We don't like that we're a Blissey main, and I said Tauruses are Blissey mains even though you're a Cancer. It matters to us because of the social identities we adopt and makes us question how we should be identifying with other Blissey mains. So let's bring it back. Why does something like this apply to draft? Why would we be behaving any differently in blind pick? Well, it doesn't only apply to draft. And it's likely our social identities are still at play in a blind pick environment. But the difference is that draft gives us more decisions to make and more information that we have to make those decisions. Not only that, it gives us more reason to make judgments about our teammates and our opponents that may lead us to making inferences about our social identities. You don't have enough information in blind pick to know that what your team is selecting is a bad choice, so you can't really blame them for it. You can, if they have the wrong items or something like that. In draft, you can see right away that first picking Cinderace will not work into what the enemy team is setting up. And it makes us want to identify with our team less, make more comparisons between us and them, and potentially make suboptimal decisions when it comes to our own picks. So what do we think about all the words that I just said? Words good? Fun, good words that makes us go, ooh, this cat is onto something. Ultimately, draft still kind of sucks, and the main explanation for it is probably that the player base just doesn't know what to do with it because their lack of information or their conscious choice to avoid learning. But that's not enough for me, so I presented a lot of possible explanations for why this might be true to cope with how bad the player base actually is. So yeah, that's it. What did you think? Let me know. That's all, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!